The sound comes first. Not the explosion, not the impact, the sound. A rising scream, guttural, metallic, like the sky itself is tearing open. German tank commanders freeze mid-order. Crews inside their Panzers feel the vibration through steel plating before they understand what's happening. Then the world erupts. 16 trails of fire arc across the frozen sky. They don't fall gracefully. They scream downward, spinning, unstable, alive with fury. The ground doesn't just shake, it convulses. Entire tank columns vanish into curtains of flame and shrapnel. Men who survive the first salvo don't have time to process what hit them before the second wave arrives. This is January 1943, the Eastern Front, and the Germans have just met a weapon they don't have a name for yet. Soviet soldiers call it the Katyusha, Little Katy. The Germans call it Stalin's organ because the rockets howl like pipes from hell. It doesn't aim. It doesn't need to. It saturates. It overwhelms. It erases. And in the snow-choked forests between Stalingrad and Kursk, this crude, terrifying machine is about to turn the tide of the largest war in human history. If you love stories hidden behind history's headlines, hit subscribe so you never miss what comes next.
Before the Katyusha became a legend, it was a gamble. In 1938, Soviet engineers at the Reactive Scientific Research Institute faced an impossible brief: create a rocket artillery system that could be mass-produced, mounted on trucks, and operated by conscripts with minimal training. Traditional artillery required precision engineering, trained crews, and heavy infrastructure. Stalin wanted something faster, cheaper, and more terrifying. The answer came from a team led by Andrei Kostakov and refined by engineers like Georgy Langemak. They designed the BM-13, a rack of 16 rails mounted on the back of a Studebaker or ZIS-6 truck. Each rail could launch an M-13 rocket, 132 millimeters in diameter, weighing 42 kilograms, carrying 4.9 kilograms of high explosive. The rocket wasn't guided, it wasn't accurate, but when 16 of them launched within 10 seconds, accuracy became irrelevant. The first prototypes were tested in secrecy. Stalin himself observed trials in 1939, watching as salvos obliterated target zones the size of football fields. He nodded once. That was enough. By 1941, the weapon was classified, so classified that crews were ordered to destroy their launchers rather than let them fall into German hands. But when Hitler's Operation Barbarossa smashed into Soviet lines in June 1941, desperation overruled secrecy.
The first combat deployment of the Katyusha happened on July 14, 1941, near the town of Orsha in Belarus. Captain Ivan Flerov commanded an experimental battery, 7 BM-13 launchers mounted on Z-6 trucks. His orders were simple: strike the German-occupied railway station, then vanish. No recovery, no second chances. The enemy could not capture this weapon. At 3:15 p.m., Flerov's battery unleashed 112 rockets in under a minute. The railway station, along with German ammunition depots and infantry positions, disappeared into a firestorm. Survivors described the attack as apocalyptic, not artillery, but something unnatural, biblical. Within hours, German commanders were radioing frantic reports of a new Soviet secret weapon. Flerov followed protocol. His trucks scattered into the forests before German reconnaissance could locate them. For 3 weeks, his unit became a ghost, striking supply convoys, troop concentrations, and command posts, then vanishing into the wilderness. But the Germans adapted. In August 1941, Flerov's battery was surrounded near Spasskaya Guba. Rather than surrender the launchers, Flerov ordered his men to rig explosives and detonate the trucks. He died in the explosion. Posthumously, he became a hero of the Soviet Union. The secret was out, but mass production had already begun.
By the winter of 1942, the Katyusha wasn't just a weapon, it was a philosophy. Soviet factories churned out BM-13 launchers at a staggering rate. Unlike German Nebelwerfer rocket systems, which required complex assembly and trained operators, the Katyusha was brutally simple. A truck, rails, rockets. No hydraulics, no advanced targeting, no delicate mechanisms. If a part broke, you replaced it. If the truck died, you mounted the rails on a new chassis. This simplicity became strategic genius. The Soviets could produce 10 Katyushas in the time it took Germany to build one precision artillery piece. And while German guns needed surveying, calculations, and static positions, the Katyusha only needed a driver and a stopwatch. The tactic was codified: shoot and scoot. A battery would roll into position under cover of darkness, unleash a full salvo in under 20 seconds, then retreat before counter-battery fire could respond. German artillery officers, trained to triangulate enemy positions through muzzle flashes, found themselves firing at empty forests. By mid-1942, entire Soviet Guards mortar divisions were formed, elite units exclusively with Katyushas. They weren't artillery in the traditional sense. They were shock troops, psychological warfare units, and mobile executioners rolled into one. And they were heading toward Stalingrad. The psychology of the Katyusha was as lethal as its payload. German soldiers began calling it the Stalin-Orgel, Stalin's organ, because the sound of 16 rockets launching in rapid sequence resembled the chords of a massive pipe organ. But there was nothing musical about it. Veterans described the noise as primal terror, a shrieking, howling crescendo that bypassed rational thought and triggered pure survival instinct. Unlike conventional artillery, which gave soldiers a few seconds to seek cover after the first shell, Katyusha salvos arrived almost simultaneously. The scream in the sky was both warning and execution. Men dove into trenches, pressed themselves into mud, clawed at frozen earth, and often still died. The rockets themselves were unstable. They tumbled in flight, trailing smoke and sparks, their trajectories wild and unpredictable. This unpredictability became an advantage. Soldiers couldn't judge where the next impact would land. Even veteran Panzer crews, men who'd survived artillery barrages from North Africa to the Caucasus, reported losing their nerve under Katyusha fire. German intelligence officers captured spent rocket casings and rushed them to Berlin for analysis. They wanted to understand the propellant, the guidance system, the targeting mechanism. What they found shocked them. There was no guidance, no sophistication, just crude, overwhelming violence. And by 1943, that violence was about to reshape the Eastern Front.
Kursk, July 1943. The largest tank battle in history is about to begin. Hitler has gambled everything on Operation Citadel, a massive pincer movement designed to encircle and destroy Soviet forces in the Kursk salient. Nearly 3,000 German tanks and assault guns, including the formidable new Tiger and Panther models, are massed for the attack. German commanders are confident. Their armor is superior, their tactics proven, their momentum unstoppable. But Soviet intelligence has known about Citadel for months, and Marshal Georgy Zhukov has prepared a welcome. Hidden across the salient's defense lines are over 300 Katyusha launchers, the largest concentration ever assembled. They're dug into concealed positions, camouflaged under netting, positioned on reverse slopes where German reconnaissance can't spot them. Soviet doctrine has evolved. Katyushas are no longer just mobile harassment weapons. They're battlefield architects, reshaping terrain through saturation fire. On July 5th, at 2:20 a.m., German artillery begins the preliminary bombardment. At 2:30 a.m., before the panzer columns even begin their advance, Soviet artillery, including massed Katyusha batteries, unleashes a preemptive counterstrike. The Germans had planned to attack at dawn. Instead, they woke up in hell. Entire staging areas erupted, fuel depots ignited, command posts collapsed, and the Panzers hadn't even started moving yet. The opening day of Kursk revealed the Katyusha's true potential. German tank columns advancing towards Soviet defensive lines suddenly found themselves navigating infernos. Katyusha batteries positioned in layered defense zones would wait until panzers entered predetermined kill zones, open fields, valley bottoms, narrow approaches, then saturate the area from multiple angles simultaneously. A single BM-13 battery firing a full salvo could blanket 400,000 square meters with high explosive fragmentation. Multiple batteries firing in coordination could delete entire grid squares from existence. German after-action reports describe fire carpets that turned advance routes into impassable burning wreckage. But the psychological impact went deeper. Panzer crews, accustomed to being the hunters, became prey. They couldn't see the launchers, couldn't suppress them with tank fire, couldn't call in effective counter-battery because the Katyushas relocated before Luftwaffe observers could transmit coordinates. Lieutenant Hans von Luck, commanding a panzer unit at Kursk, later wrote, "We feared Soviet tanks, we respected their artillery, but the Katyushas made us question everything. How do you assault a position when the approach itself is a death sentence?" The answer for many German units was you don't. Entire panzer battalions stalled, not from enemy tanks, but from commanders refusing to advance into Katyusha kill zones. For the first time, German armor doctrine, speed, shock, and breakthrough was being systematically paralyzed. As Kursk ground into its second week, patterns emerged. Soviet Katyusha tactics had evolved into a science. Batteries operated in fire groups, clusters of 3 to 5 launchers positioned several hundred meters apart. When German forces identified one position through muzzle flash or sound, they'd call in artillery or airstrikes. By the time ordnance arrived, the launchers were gone, already racing to alternate positions 2 kilometers away. The Soviets developed false battery positions, wooden frames shaped like trucks, positioned to draw German fire. Luftwaffe pilots reported destroying dozens of Katyusha launchers. Ground reconnaissance would later reveal burnt timber and canvas. Meanwhile, actual Katyusha batteries operated from forested areas, riverbeds, and even urban ruins. Soviet doctrine emphasized that a moving Katyusha was worth 10 static artillery pieces. Drivers became as crucial as gunners, knowing terrain, understanding timing, executing withdrawals under fire. German intelligence intercepted Soviet radio traffic referring to Katyusha units by the codename Gvardeyskiye Minometi, Guards mortars. This designation wasn't ceremonial. It meant elite status, better supplies, priority replacements, and, most importantly, operational independence. Katyusha commanders could engage targets of opportunity without waiting for higher authorization. This flexibility, combined with the weapon's inherent terror factor, meant German forces never knew when or where the next salvo would arrive. And uncertainty, in war, is its own casualty multiplier. By August 1943, the German offensive at Kursk had collapsed. The panzers withdrew, battered and bleeding. But the Katyushas weren't finished. They followed. As German forces retreated westward, attempting to establish new defensive lines, Soviet Katyusha batteries pursued like mechanized wolves. They'd strike rearguard positions at dusk, disrupting withdrawal schedules. They'd bombard river crossings, turning bottleneck evacuations into massacres.
They'd hit supply depots at night, denying fuel and ammunition to frontline units. The psychological toll became measurable. German casualty reports from late 1943 show increasing numbers of soldiers classified as Kriegsneurotiker, war neurotics. Men who'd survived years of combat suddenly broke under the sustained terror of unpredictable rocket fire. One captured German diary entry dated September 1943 reads, "The Stalin Orgel doesn't just kill bodies, it kills certainty. You cannot plan, you cannot rest, you cannot know if the next breath will be your last. I fear the scream more than the explosion." Soviet doctrine leaned into this fear. Katyusha batteries were ordered to fire at irregular intervals, sometimes multiple salvos within minutes, sometimes hours of silence followed by sudden barrages. The unpredictability prevented German forces from establishing rhythm or routine. Sleep deprivation, constant alertness, shattered morale. The Katyusha had become more than artillery. It had become a siege weapon that moved. The Germans tried to adapt. They always did. Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights increased, hunting for Katyusha positions. German artillery developed priority target protocols. If you spotted a Soviet truck convoy, you fired immediately, no confirmation needed. Panzer divisions deployed dedicated anti-air batteries, hoping to catch launchers during reload. But the Soviets evolved faster. New tactics emerged. Katyushas would fire from behind Soviet frontline positions, launching over their own troops to strike German positions. The rockets' high trajectory meant they could clear forward defenses. And Soviet infantry learned to recognize the sound, cover for 10 seconds, then advance through the chaos. Dummy batteries multiplied. For every operational Katyusha launcher, Soviets positioned 3 fake ones. Logs painted green, canvas stretched over wooden frames, even captured German trucks modified to resemble BM-13s. German intelligence reports became unreliable. Every truck convoy might be a threat. Every forest could hide a battery. By early 1944, German commanders were allocating disproportionate resources to counter Katyusha operations. Units that should have been engaging Soviet armor were instead hunting rocket launchers that moved like ghosts. The strategic impact was profound. The Katyusha wasn't just destroying German equipment. It was distorting German decision-making, forcing tactical paralysis, and consuming resources that couldn't be replaced. And the Red Army was just beginning its march toward Berlin.
January 1944. Operation Bagration, the Soviet offensive that would shatter Army Group Center, begins with fire. In the forests of Belarus, over 500 Katyusha launchers are positioned along a 700-kilometer front. This isn't harassment fire anymore. This is industrial-scale destruction. At 5 a.m. on June 23rd, the largest coordinated Katyusha barrage in history erupts. For 30 minutes, the sky above German positions screams. Not in waves, not in salvos, in a continuous rolling thunderstorm of high explosive death. German defensive lines, carefully constructed over 3 years, reinforced with bunkers, minefields, and pre-sighted artillery, simply cease to exist. Command posts vaporize, communication trenches collapse, ammunition depots detonate in chain reactions that consume entire battalions. The revelation that horrifies German high command isn't the destruction, it's the scale. Soviet factories are now producing Katyusha rockets faster than Germany can manufacture artillery shells. The BM-13 launcher costs roughly 10,000 rubles to build. A German Panzer IV costs 103,000 Reichsmarks. The economic mathematics are brutal. The Soviets can afford to saturate entire grid squares with fire. Germany cannot afford to replace what's being destroyed. Within 48 hours of Bagration's opening, Army Group Center has lost cohesion. Not because Soviet tanks broke through, but because the Katyushas had already broken the German will to hold. The turning point wasn't a battle, it was a calculation. By summer 1944, the secret was fully revealed, but the truth was worse than the Germans imagined. The Katyusha wasn't just a weapon, it was a system, an ecosystem of terror that integrated mobility, mass production, and psychological warfare into a single platform. Allied intelligence, sharing data with Soviet counterparts, discovered that German frontline troops had developed superstitions around the Katyusha. Some units refused to occupy positions that had been previously struck, believing the launchers remembered coordinates. Others claimed they could sense when a barrage was coming, a phantom pressure in the air, a silence before the scream. Medical officers reported that soldiers exposed to sustained Katyusha bombardment showed symptoms similar to naval shell shock. Hearing loss, tremors, difficulty making decisions under pressure, and a phenomenon they called rocket fear. A paralyzing anxiety triggered not by incoming fire, but by the possibility of it. The Soviets had weaponized uncertainty itself. And the final revelation came in August 1944, when German forces encountered newer variants, the BM-31 with 300mm rockets and the experimental BM-13M with improved range and accuracy. The weapon they'd first encountered in 1941, crude, unstable, terrifying, had evolved. And the Germans were still retreating from the original version. The question was no longer how to counter the Katyusha. It was whether they ever could.
April 1945, the Battle of Berlin, the final act. Soviet forces encircle the German capital, and massed Katyusha batteries take positions in the suburbs. Over 400 launchers ring the city, more firepower than had been deployed at Kursk, Bagration, or any single battle in the war. On April 20th, Hitler's birthday, Marshal Zhukov orders a gift, a simultaneous Katyusha barrage from all batteries surrounding Berlin. For 10 minutes, the city is bombarded with thousands of rockets. It's not strategic, it's not even militarily necessary. It's a statement. The Germans had brought blitzkrieg, lightning war, to Soviet cities. Now, the Soviets bring the thunder to Berlin. Inside the Führer bunker, Hitler's staff reports the barrage. The Führer doesn't respond. By this point, he's stopped asking about the Eastern Front. The Katyusha scream has become the soundtrack of Germany's collapse. Soviet infantry advancing into Berlin carry a dark joke. The Katyusha clears the way, we just walk through. It's not entirely hyperbole. Entire city blocks are reduced to rubble before ground troops arrive. The weapon that started as an experimental gamble, crude, unguided, built for speed over sophistication, has become the herald of the Third Reich's end. And when the Reich falls on May 8, 1945, the last sound many German soldiers remember is that rising scream.
The war ends. The counting begins. Over 10,000 Katyusha launchers were produced during the war. Over 6 million rockets fired. Casualty estimates attributed directly to BM-13 and BM-31 systems range from 100,000 to over 200,000 German soldiers killed or wounded, but the indirect impact is incalculable. How do you measure morale collapse? How do you quantify the strategic paralysis caused by fear? How many German offensives stalled not because they were stopped, but because commanders refused to advance into probable kill zones? Soviet factories continued producing Katyushas through 1946, refining the design, improving accuracy, increasing payload. The weapon system was exported to Soviet allies. Poland received BM-13s. North Korea built domestic variants, and Chinese factories would later produce the Type 63, a direct descendant. For the Germans, the psychological scars endured. Post-war interviews with Wehrmacht veterans consistently cite the Katyusha as one of the most feared weapons of the Eastern Front, ranking alongside T-34 tanks and Ilyushin IL-2 ground attack aircraft. But unlike tanks or planes, the Katyusha wasn't respected, it was dreaded. Tankers admired the T-34's engineering. Pilots feared the Il-2's firepower. But the Katyusha? Soldiers simply wanted to never hear that sound again. And in Soviet Russia, the Katyusha became more than a weapon. It became a symbol. Today, you can see Katyusha monuments across former Soviet states. Metal sculptures of BM-13 launchers frozen in the moment of fire, rockets pointed toward a sky that no longer screams. The song Katyusha, written in 1938 about a girl waiting for her soldier, became forever linked with the weapon. Soviet soldiers sang it on the march. Crews painted the name on their trucks. The girl and the gun merged into mythology. But the legacy runs deeper than monuments and songs. The Katyusha established the doctrine of mobile rocket artillery, a concept that dominates modern warfare. American MLRS systems, Russian Grad launchers, Chinese PHL systems, all descendants of that original 1938 gamble. The idea that mobility, saturation fire, and psychological impact could outweigh precision, that was Katyusha. It proved that in total war, terror has tactical value, that crude engineering, mass-produced and mobile, can defeat sophisticated technology, that sometimes the weapon that wins isn't the best, it's the one that breaks the enemy's will to fight. The secret artillery that turned the Eastern Front into a graveyard for Panzers wasn't just rockets and trucks. It was the sound of inevitability. If this story moved you, share it so more people can discover the truths time almost erased. Every event, number, and character in this documentary has been verified through historical and documented sources. In the silence that followed, history took a deep breath and changed forever.